Good evening and welcome back to the Kyle Phoenix Show. As always, I'm your host, Kyle Phoenix. And we are working through our lessons with the course. So, today's lesson number 13, A Meaningless World Engenders Fear. Today's idea is really another form of the preceding one, except that it is more specific as to the emotion aroused. Actually, a meaningless world is impossible. Nothing without meaning exists. However, it does not follow that you will not think you perceive something that has no meaning. On the contrary, you will be particularly likely to think you do perceive it. Recognition of meaninglessness arouses intense anxiety in all the separated ones. It represents a situation in which God and the ego challenge each other as to whose meaning is to be written in the empty space that meaninglessness provides. The ego rushes in frantically to establish its own ideas there, fearful that the void may otherwise be used to demonstrate its own importance and unreality. And on this alone, it is correct. So, what do we mean when we say a meaningless world? A meaningless world is the sense of, okay, everything is random. Everything has no meaning. Everything just happens to me. I have no control over my life. When we have those kinds of thoughts, we might think of them in a concept maybe of self-pity, we might think of them as self-doubt, but in fact what they also are is the mind, or the ego, because we're talking about the mind and the ego being two separate things, but the ego being an aspect of the mind that we're trying to eliminate or mitigate to some degree. The ego is saying, I have determined what the world is. I have determined that the world is absolutely random. There's no order to it. There's no sense to it. There's no plan. You have no destiny. There is no fate. This is just all happening to you, and you're going to die. There's always the overwhelming burden of death is on the way because of this randomness. What the Course is saying here is that that's a competitive thought against the concept of God. So when you hear people say that, or you say that to yourself, what they're really doing is their ego projection is competing with the concept of God, because literally what God is says that there's an intention here. There's an intentionality to the universe. Now, what I will say, and from my own personal experience in having to learn, is that I may not have the capacity, the mental capacity, to completely see the totality of the intention of God. And therefore, it can feel and look like randomness because the aperture of my lens, my mental lens, just isn't big enough to encapsulate all of what is happening. So, an example, and when I was about 15 years old, my grandmother passed away. So I had the experience of her for about 15 years, and so I have memory experience of her about maybe 8 or 9 years of remembering going to her house. And I remember a birthday party that we had at her house for me. I remember her hobbies, the things she liked to do, the books she liked to read, the food she liked to cook, all those different kinds of things. But when I met her, or had the experience of meeting her and being with her, she was in a period of decline health-wise. So there was less experience for us. Maybe there was only a few times where we were actually outside of her house, going out to different places. So that is one aspect of what our relationship was. Now I could say, something, I didn't get any time with my grandmother. That the world, just by the time I was born, because of health care, all those different kinds of things, I didn't get that. Or I can say, wait a second, that time I got with her, that's how long the class, the Dorothy May class, was supposed to be. I was supposed to have this much time with her. Now let me examine that time, the value of that time. So, fast forward years later. I saw some movie of the week, and B. Arthur was in the movie of the week. And her doctor says to her that, that she has some kind of terminal illness. And she's looking at, well, what is she going to do in her life? How is she essentially going to wrap up her life? So I'm looking at this, and I'm like, wow, okay. And then he tells her, she says, well, she doesn't feel she has a very vibrant life to begin with. And he says, well, you are a very vibrant person. And one of the things that he mentions is she reads 5 books a week. And then, so it always stuck in my mind as a goal. I was a teenager then, to read 5 books a week. Now, I connected that a little bit back to my grandmother was a voracious reader, so that she always had about 5 or 6 books on the nightstand next to her bed that she was working her way through. And she did everything from pulp fiction to horror to suspense to westerns. Interesting thing being, my family would bring her all kinds of books, but because there was no focused curriculum, she just got lots of books, so she read everything. So I see the B. Arthur movie a couple of years after she passes away. And then I make it a little goal to try to, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 books a week being the pinnacle. A few years later, talking to my students in class, and they say, well, reading, and I'm talking about the importance of reading, and you've got to read more and do more, and how do you do it? And then they asked me some of my reflective, what do you do? What are your practices? And I said, well, I read a lot, and I read on average about 5 books a week. Now, this concept has played a line all the way through, as a mini goal or an internal goal around reading, a level of hobby and work and school. But it started because then I realized, when I reflected it all the way back, I was like, yeah, I heard about this B. Arthur movie. But then I connected it back again, and I said, wait a second, my grandmother read about 5 or 6 books a week, because there was always a pile of books on her nightstand. And I'd never thought about that and counted in consciously what that meant. I had thought about her reading in the sense that, she got me started with reading adult books and everything, even though I was a young teenager. And I had never thought about the fact that she was preparing a track that has, sparked and kept within me and then has blossomed. Therefore, our time together, even to that smallest example, was not meaningless. So we don't live in a meaningless world. It just may take me 20 years for the aperture to completely open up for me to see what I was taking in watching her do all this kind of reading. As always, Kyle Phoenix, and stay tuned for our next lesson.